Well, dear friends, it was indeed a great honor to be member of the USA for UN. Welcome to the United Nations, and I'm very grateful to Cathy Calvin and the UN Foundation for making this happen. And I also thank Teta Banks and the leadership of the United Nations Association of the United States. And I want to congratulate you on the 75th anniversary. And we will have next year the commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And I hope there will be lots of occasions for interaction with the peoples of the world, starting by the people of the United States of America, in order for the UN to be able to reform and to be more able to respond to the aspirations and the needs of the peoples of this world. Now, before we start our conversation, allow me to make 3 very quick points. First, and a simple thank you to you all as Americans. Even at the height of the Second World War, USA's founders knew that grassroots American support would be essential to create an organization that could win the peace. And among them was Eleanor Roosevelt, who had such a profound influence in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and who worked so hard to build your organization after she retired as US Ambassador to the General Assembly. And throughout the history of the United Nations, since its founding in San Francisco in 1945, the United States leadership and generosity have always been indispensable. It is no coincidence that the first words of the UN Charter, "We the peoples," echo the US Constitution. I believe the US Constitution starts by "We the people." Here it's "we the peoples," but it's the same inspiration. And I recall from my time as High Commissioner for Refugees the importance of US support, the largest donor in humanitarian aid around the world, the largest contributor to the United Nations core budget and to our peacekeeping operations. And over the years, the United States has played a critical role in helping to provide multilateral answers to global challenges. I always say that the US engagement in the world is one of the strongest forms of support to the United Nations and to our activities. And so I'm very happy to be with all of you here today. And then we need multilateralism and the engagement of the US more than ever, because we live in testing times. From climate change to migration to terrorism to the downsides of globalization, our challenges are more and more global and more integrated. But the responses are more and more fragmented, despite the fact that no single country or organization can address these issues alone. It's a kind of a paradox. As our threats become more global, our capacity to respond becomes more fragmented. And that is why we are facing the enormous difficulties and problems we face in today's world. But of course, saying this is simply not enough, because there is a trust deficit out there in the world. As inequality grows and people in all regions are questioning the effectiveness of international cooperation and of organizations like the UN. And so the biggest challenge for governments and for institutions like ours is to be able to show that we care especially for those people that feel that they are being left behind with the technological progress and globalization in the rust belts of this world. To show that we are able to mobilize solutions that respond to the people's fears and anxieties with answers, with concrete answers for the problems we feel. And we need to demonstrate that the UN is standing up for the people left behind and is connecting to their needs, aspirations, and everyday problems. And I believe the UN is delivering. In the last 2 months alone, we won approval of the work program of the Paris Agreement on climate change in Katowice. Many people thought we would not be able to do it, but it was possible to bring together all countries of the world. We didn't solve the climate change problem, but at least we approved the work plan of the Paris Agreement. We adopted also the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. And in our surge of diplomacy for peace, supported by the UN, we are trying and we are starting to succeed in some very important situations of conflict resolution. You have seen that it was possible to broker a ceasefire in Odeida, in Yemen. Let's hope it brings peace and a political agreement. We had recently an important peace agreement on Central African Republic. South Sudan, it was possible to bring together the two leaders and to finally look for the possibility of peace in this country where people have suffered so much. And the US was so strongly engaged for the independence of South Sudan. So I believe the peace in South Sudan has a huge meaning for the population of the United States. But to deliver more, we need to have a UN that is more nimble, more effective, more cost-effective, and more able to overcome the bureaucratic problems and the impediments that always exist in international organizations. And to do all these, we need you. When I look on all of you from dozens of states and universities around the country, I see ambassadors. Ambassadors for understanding, cooperation, and connecting the world of the United Nations with the grassroots. There is no more important issue today than in this context, and I would single out this problem because it's probably the most dramatic that we are facing. We need to together address climate change, the climate crisis. And I know that you agree with me. A recent UN Foundation poll found that climate change is a top priority for young Americans. But climate change is unfortunately running faster than our efforts to slow it. There are good news because there are solutions at hand in the pipeline. There is a technological evolution that makes more and more the green economy the economy of the future. But political will is still lagging behind. And that is why I'm convening a Climate Action Summit in September here in New York to raise ambition. Ambition for mitigation, for adaptation, for financing, for innovation, to really defeat climate change. And today I'm asking for your help in sounding the alarm and in highlighting the solutions. I'm going to tweet a call for #ClimateAction, and I want you to all respond on Twitter, highlighting the steps you are taking to beat the climate change. And I will feature some of our responses on my own Twitter account. Like that, we will be together in this very important endeavor. I firmly believe that we can win this race if we all pull together. And the same argument goes to all our other challenges we face in today's world. You are all committed multilateralists, and I thank you for your service as ambassadors for a better world. I feel inspired by your energy, by your engagement. Keep it up, because we need you more than ever.
Thank you.
I believe that you have some questions.
Yes, and I'm going to help you with those questions. Before the summit, we asked UNA members, and thank you for those inspiring remarks, by the way. Before the summit, we asked UNA members to submit questions. We got a lot of great questions, but we're just selecting a few for you to address today. So the first person, I would like to ask David Blattman of Andover, Massachusetts. David, if you can press your mic and ask their question.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Secretary General. My name is David Blattman. I'm an international relations student at Suffolk University in Boston. My question for you this... Thank you. Thank you, sir. Much obliged. So, my question for you this morning is, in your view, in your opinion, what is the greatest threat to international peace and security that we face in the modern world? And perhaps more importantly, what can we do to address that? What can we do about that?
Well, looking at today, I think the biggest threat comes from the fact that we have a number of conflicts that are becoming more and more interlinked, with fighters that go from one place to another. If you look from Nigeria to Mali, from Mali to Libya, from Libya to Syria, from Syria to Yemen, from Yemen to Afghanistan, you see all these conflicts becoming interlinked and linked to a threat of global terrorism. There was always terrorism, but it was kind of an isolated terrorism, and I felt that the United States was probably the first meaningful target of global terrorism with the 9/11 terrible tragedy that we all recall. But now it became a threat everywhere. I mean, we can have a terrorist attack in any place of the world at any time because it became a global threat. And this combination of conflicts multiplying and interlinking with terrorism is probably today's biggest threat. But I think that we have a serious problem with non-proliferation. Chemical attacks have been multiplying, as we have seen, and there is a clear ban on use of chemicals. And we are now seeing the risks in relation to the nuclear non-proliferation, with some of the pillars of the nuclear disarmament agenda being put into question. So I think there are new threats coming, and we need to be careful. But for the moment, I still think it is this combination of conflicts interlinked and terrorism.
Thank you.
For peace and security, there are other threats. Climate change is a big threat to all of us. The misuse of certain technologies, like information technologies, artificial intelligence, is another potential threat to all of us. But for the moment, I think, for peace and security, the one I mentioned is probably the largest.
Thank you. Our next question...
And of course, what can we do? We are very much engaged in active mediation in many of these conflicts. And we have launched a new office for counterterrorism, and we are creating a network of plans against violent extremism all around the world to try to address the root causes of terrorism in many societies in close cooperation with those societies. And if you look at the mediation efforts that were possible in Yemen, in Libya, with everything we have tried in Syria, I mean, it's the idea to try to disconnect those conflicts and to disconnect them from the terrorist threat.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ruth Miller from Alaska. Ruth, if you can press your mic and have a seat. Press your mic, please.
Where is Alaska?
Yahlidu Ruth Miller shi'iji. Dena enak hanaga shethkun kenash chikanik hali kiriki. Hello, my name is Ruth Miller, and I'm a member of the Kuryong tribe of Dena'ina Athabaskan from Anchorage, Alaska, attending Brown University. Alaska and the Arctic are particularly vulnerable to climate change, where resource extraction has had devastating environmental and humanitarian impacts and is only being accelerated despite international agreement. Indigenous people in the circumpolar north are beyond are suffering today the loss of land, water, and food sources, threatening the preservation of our cultural practices. What new commitments will the United Nations make to culturally reflexive climate justice for the defense of the environment and the indigenous people who depend on it?
Well, indigenous people, and I would say the developing world in general, as in Africa and in other parts of the world, have this paradox. They practically do not contribute to climate change, and sometimes they are the main victims of climate change. And so we need to combine two very aggressive campaigns. One for mitigation, to make sure that countries, especially the G20 countries, the largest countries in the world that correspond to 80% of the emissions, really reduce the emissions, because without reduction of the emissions, we will be facing a catastrophic situation globally. But then we need to have a very strong increase in our investment in support to adaptation in the areas that are more dramatically impacted, and the indigenous peoples are clearly in the front line. And until now, the investment in adaptation is proven to be not enough. If you have seen, and now I'm not talking about only indigenous people, but you have seen the disasters in the Caribbean and even the impact in the United States of some of the storms that take place, you see how much we need to invest in making sure that our communities are more resilient in relation to the impacts of climate change. And the indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable, so we need to have a strong support to their countries in order to be able to provide them with those instruments that allows them to resist better to the climate change impacts.
Unfortunately, Your Excellency, we're out of time.
No excellencies, yeah.
We're
you know
out
that
of time.
it's true. I mean, where I work with my colleagues, if anyone says excellency, there is a fine of $1,000. And that's how we are trying to solve the financial problems of the UN. It's true.
So we want to thank you for spending time with members of the United Nations Association of the USA. We appreciate your leadership. We'll continue to support you and continue to support the United Nations. So thank you.
There's still time for a third question.
Yeah. I can't say no to him, so he's asked for a third question. So we're going to have our third question. The final question will come from, let's see, Brian Ramirez from San Antonio. Brian, could you please press your mic?
Yes, thank you.
Where are you?
I'm right here. Right here. Over here. Hi, Mr. Secretary General. I am Brian Ramirez from San Antonio, Texas. My question is, with the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment throughout the Western world, what efforts to protect the human rights and dignity of refugees and immigrants around the world is the UN committed to?
So the question was? You know, I was High Commissioner for Refugees for 10 years. And refugees are those that flee, not because they want to leave, not because they want a better future, but because they are forced to flee by a conflict or by oppression, by violations of their basic human rights, by a dictatorship in any part of the world. And so in relation to refugees, there is an international law obligation for countries to protect refugees, and for refugees never to be sent back to their countries of origin. And our appeal to all countries of the world is to keep their borders open to refugees and to grant their protection and to allow them to integrate in their societies, at least during the time in which they are not able to go back to their countries of origin. And I would say that this international protection regime, until a few years ago, was widely respected. We are seeing now, unfortunately, a trend, especially in the richest countries of the world, to be more restrictive in relation to refugees. The good news is that when I look at, for instance, an African continent, I was there just 1 week ago, African countries are keeping their borders open, are receiving sometimes more than 1 million refugees in one country, the case of Uganda, the case of Ethiopia, and really trying to do their best to support them. And we need to mobilize the whole of the international community, first, to share that burden, to also receive refugees, and second, to strongly support those countries that are being so generous, like Jordan, like Ethiopia, like Kenya, and that have received hundreds of thousands, sometimes more than 1 million refugees. Now, migrants is a different story. There is not the right of a person to migrate anytime, anywhere. But we also need to make sure that the human rights of migrants are respected. And we need to understand that we need to combine the interests, legitimate interests of states with the rights of migrants. Now, I come from a country, Portugal, where the fertility index is 1.3. Fortunately, it's not the case of the United States. But which means that the Portuguese society is not sustainable without migration. We will disappear in time if we have no migration. And my mother is 96 years old. And she has a 24/7 support of someone with some, I would say, healthcare capacity, always there to support her. When I visit my mother, I've never seen a Portuguese taking care of her. And Portugal is not a very rich country. It's always migrant workers that are there taking care of my mother. And when one looks at the situation in my continent, in Europe, more and more, even to take care of elderly people, migrants are absolutely essential. Which means migration is a positive thing. What is negative is the fact that so many people are forced to migrate in a way that is irregular, in the hands of smugglers and traffickers that tragically violate their human rights, and we need to combine more opportunities of legal migration, a strong crackdown on smugglers and traffickers, being able to persecute them with the same efficiency that, for instance, we have in relation to drug traffickers, but at the same time more and more to invest in the countries of origin, to give people the possibility to choose to remain in their countries and build their future with confidence in their own countries. If you combine these three things, I think we'll have a much more humane world in which migration can play a positive role for the people themselves and for the countries, both north and south. Okay? Thank you very much. Bye-bye.